Story 1. Lola had always been a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. But everything changed that night when she encountered something that defied all logic and reason. It was a night like any other. Lola had finished her workday, taken a hot shower, and gotten ready for bed. The room was dark, except for the faint moonlight streaming through the slightly open window. She lay down, pulled the blanket over herself, and closed her eyes, ready for another peaceful night's sleep. But sleep never came. At first, she couldn't quite identify what was making her feel uneasy. It was just a strange sensation, like something, or someone, was watching her. She slowly opened her eyes, scanning the dark room. Nothing seemed out of place. The closet was closed, the bedroom door slightly ajar as always, and the silence was absolute. That's when she noticed it. In the darkest corner of the room, near the window, there was a figure. It was a tall, thin man with a rigid, unnatural posture. He stood there motionless, as if waiting for something. A chill ran down Lola's spine. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a trick of light and shadow. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized the figure was real. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching her. Lola tried to scream, but her voice failed her. She tried to move, but her body felt trapped, as if she were under the effects of sleep paralysis. But she knew she wasn't asleep. This was real. And then, something happened. The man's head began to change. Slowly, it started to stretch upward in a way that defied human anatomy. His skin seemed to contract and expand, as if something inside him was trying to break free. His eyes, once dark and empty, glowed with a sinister red light. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing jagged, razor-sharp teeth. Panic consumed Lola. She tried once more to move, but it was as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The man began to move toward her, but not in the way a human would. His steps were awkward, almost animalistic, as if he were dragging himself toward her. And then he started pounding on his chest. The sound was low at first, like a distant drum, but soon it grew louder, more violent. The man pounded his own chest with force, as if he were trying to get the attention of something or someone. Lola felt the sound reverberate through her own body, as if each strike was meant for her. Suddenly, the man stopped beating his chest and lunged at Lola. In an instant, he was on top of her, his long, bony hands gripping her shoulders with inhuman strength. Lola tried to fight back, but he was too strong. He started pounding on her chest, repeating the same wild, frenzied motion. Each blow was accompanied by a rough, guttural sound from his throat, as if he was trying to speak but could only manage deep, animalistic grunts. Lola felt his nails scraping against her skin, cutting her like knives. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The man leaned in closer, his deformed face now just inches from hers. She could smell the stench of rot coming from his mouth, a foul odor that made her stomach churn. He began to strangle her, his hands tightening around her neck with a force she had never felt before. Lola felt her vision darken, her body growing weaker. She knew she was about to die. That's when she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she was back in her bed, the room bathed in the morning sunlight. She was drenched in sweat, trembling, but alive. For a moment, she tried to convince herself it had all been a nightmare, a terrible hallucination brought on by stress. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw the marks on her neck, finger-shaped bruises, long and thin, as if someone had tried to strangle her. And in the corner of the room, near the window, there was a dark footprint on the floor, as if something had burned into the carpet. Lola never slept in that room again. She moved out a few weeks later, but to this day, she still feels its presence, like it's just waiting for the right moment to return. Story 2. Brian had always been a laid-back person. He enjoyed quiet nights at home, watching detective shows on TV while relaxing on the couch. But that night would be different. That night would change everything. It was late, and Brian was home alone. His parents had gone out to visit some friends, and he decided to take advantage of the peace and quiet to binge-watch his favorite show. The episode was about an unsolved murder, and the show's eerie atmosphere seemed to seep into the room, making the air feel heavy. Brian started to feel his eyelids grow heavy, and before he knew it, he had fallen asleep on the couch. He didn't know how much time had passed when he woke up, or rather, when he thought he had woken up. Brian sat up on the couch, but something was terribly wrong. He couldn't move properly. His limbs felt heavy, as if they were being held down by an invisible force. He tried to stand, but his body wouldn't respond. That's when he realized he was outside of his own body. Brian looked down and saw his own body still lying on the couch, motionless, as if in a deep sleep. Panic began to take hold of him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. He tried to move, but it was as if he were trapped in a lucid dream. Only he knew he wasn't dreaming. This was real. Determined to understand what was happening, Brian forced himself to stand. His movements felt strange, as if he were floating rather than walking. He made his way to the back door of the house and looked outside. The darkness was absolute. There were no stars, no moon, just an empty, oppressive void that seemed to swallow everything around it. A chill ran down Brian's spine. Something in that darkness was watching him. He backed away from the door and moved to the other side of the room, where a large window overlooked the garden. To his shock, outside, it was daytime. The sun shone brightly, and the sky was clear and blue. The stark contrast between the darkness of the back door and the brightness outside the window left him even more confused and terrified. That's when he saw her. Under a tree by the lake, sitting on a wooden bench, was an old woman. She had her back to him, wearing a faded antique dress. Her gray hair was unkempt, and she seemed to be rocking slightly back and forth, as if humming something. Brian felt a tightness in his chest. There was something deeply wrong about that scene. He tried to step away from the window, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The old woman stopped rocking and slowly began to turn. Brian's heart pounded. He didn't want to see her face, but he couldn't look away. When she finally turned around, Brian nearly screamed. The old woman's face was a grotesque distortion of humanity. Her skin was pale and wrinkled, but there was something unnatural about its texture, as if it were melting. Her eyes were as black as coal, dull, lifeless. And her smile, it was far too wide, filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth like those of an animal. She rose from the bench and began walking toward the house. Her movements were awkward, as if she wasn't used to walking. Brian tried to back away from the window, but his legs wouldn't obey. He could feel her presence drawing closer, the air around him growing heavier, denser. "You shouldn't be here," a raspy voice whispered, coming from everywhere at once. Brian didn't know if it was the old woman speaking, but a wave of despair washed over him. He knew that if she reached him, something terrible would happen. That's when he squeezed his eyes shut, focusing all his will on waking up. He could feel the old woman's claws almost touching his face when, suddenly, he jolted awake on the couch, sweating and shaking. His body was back to normal, and the house was silent. Brian looked toward the window. It was nighttime, and the garden was dark. There was no sign of the old woman or the lake. He tried to convince himself it had all been just a nightmare, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The old woman was out there somewhere, waiting, and she knew where he lived.